Welcome to Part 2 of the introduction of Asclepius, the perfect discourse of Hermes Trismegistus, translated by Clement Salaman. The cycles of time. There was a strong awareness in ancient Egypt of the cyclical nature of time, an idea that is also present in Hesiod, Plato, and Synesius. It is well reflected in the Asclepius. Each cycle started with a creative impulse which needed to be renewed, and human participation was a part of this cosmic event. The daily temple rituals accompanied the sun's rising and journey across the sky with all its perils, and worked to ensure that this was successfully accomplished. The New Year festival brought in the inundation on which the whole population depended. There were longer cycles too. The timing of all these festivals had deep significance for the realignment of society to Ma'at, the concept of justice and order. Hermes' prophecy. There is a prophecy in the Asclepius which suggests that over a long cycle the departure from Ma'at had been very extensive. The memory of the functions of man had been lost. This had a grave effect not only on mankind but on nature. The gods will withdraw from earth to heaven. Foreigners pouring into the land will neglect religion. Duties to the gods and divine worship will be prohibited with penalties. This holy land will be filled with sepulchres and the dead. Only stories of your religion will survive, and these your children will not believe. Egypt will become a desert, an example of the most ferocious cruelty. The fruits of the earth will wither, and the land will no longer be fertile. The very air will hang heavy in lifeless torpor. Such will be the old age of the world, irreligion, disorder, and unreason concerning all that is good. To understand the gravity of this, one needs to consider further the Hermetic vision of the cosmos. It was based on a system of reflections. As has been said in the Emerald Tablet, attributed to Hermes, it is written, "As above, so below." The cosmos is the visible image of the Supreme. Man, also an image of the Supreme, has the function to reverence and care for the creation. Egypt had a special place within it. It was the image of heaven, the temple of the whole cosmos. It was particularly shocking that the inhabitants of this favored land should forget their sacred trust. There had been, perhaps, another insidious departure from Ma'at. This is described by Hermes as a creation of terrestrial gods. He writes, "Because skeptical ancestors erred greatly in their opinion of the gods and gave no attention to worship and divine religion, they invented an art by which they could create gods. The essence of this art was to make statues which were then enlivened by persuading spirits to dwell therein by sacred and divine rites. The statues could do harm, but also bring great benefits to men. The gods of ours help us as though they were loving parents. Either they attend to particular matters, or they foretell the future through lot and divination, or they provide certain things, and by these means they come to help human beings, each in his own way. These terrestrial gods could also be regarded as a further example of the reflection of heaven on earth." Why then does Hermes say, our skeptical ancestors erred greatly? This seeming contradiction is not easy to resolve, but it does seem that the practice of enlivening statues is associated with giving no attention to worship and divine religion. In other words, neglecting the primary role of mankind. The benefits conferred by the terrestrial gods do not directly assist this function. The ancestors of Hermes and his disciples had apparently devised a method of obtaining the blessings of terrestrial gods, while not attending to their own responsibilities by ignoring the worship of the heavenly gods. In a way, they had become prisoners of their own creation. These terrestrial gods could become angry and might need to be propitiated. This actually reminds me of Exodus 32 in the Bible, where the Israelites created a golden calf idol to worship because they became impatient with Moses' absence while he was receiving the Ten Commandments. Anyway, continuing on. Hermes' prophecy is indeed dire, and yet is unusually accurate in specific detail. One may be filled with awe when one considers the fate of Egypt and the Egyptians, and compares it with the rich legacy of Greece and Rome, which the West has inherited. The very race has disappeared. We see every day Celtic, Roman, and Saxon types, but in Egypt one looks in vain for that reddish skin, the heads elongated to the rear, the almond eyes and full lips. Indeed, the true successors to the ancient Egyptians are to be found amongst those who have a strong affinity with their spirit. It was not until the early 19th century that Egyptian hieroglyphs could be deciphered, and then only because of the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Many explanations are given of Egyptian architecture, and yet the purpose and significance of the three great pyramids of Giza remain a mystery. Were they tombs? But there are no sarcophagi or original inscriptions. Egyptological tradition tells us that the Egyptians were a people obsessed with death, and that this is the subject of their art. Yet, more recent views explain that their theme was primarily life. A great religion has been reduced to a series of children's stories. All this marks the oblivion of race, language, and culture. But when did this happen? Most scholars agree that the Corpus Hermeticum and Asclepius were composed between 100 and 300 AD. However, nothing of such a cataclysmic nature had happened to Egypt, or even threatened to happen, by the end of the 3rd century, although there were many ancient predictions of coming disasters. This one seems surprisingly accurate in detail. However, from these scenes of death and destruction springs renewal. The perfect order of Ma'at will be restored. Then the Lord and Father, who is first in power and governor under God, who is the One, will consider the conduct and willful deeds of men. He will take a stand against these evils. Either he will dissolve all this in a flood or consume it by fire. Finally, he will restore the world to its ancient beauty. By these events, the world will be reborn. What was such a time like? The tradition is recorded in Manetho that for many years the country was ruled by heavenly gods. In later times, the pharaohs were presented as gods who had taken human form. But such divine men were not restricted to a pharaonic role. Men walked the earth who had become gods, not by the report of others, but by their own study and discipline. A man of such stature, who had wholly identified with the god taught, may have been the reputed author of the Asclepius, which, unlike the Corpus Hermeticum, reads as though written by a single person. And it's interesting here, this men worked the earth who could become gods, not by report, but by their own study and discipline. Reminds me a lot of the teachings of S.N. Goenka with his Vipassana meditation teaching. It's the same thing. It's all about experiencing reality as it is, not as it appears to be. It has to be done by your own experience, your own actual experience, not the experience of others. I think there's a very big correlation there. Anyway, continuing. Hermes. Hermes was the title that the ancient Greeks gave to the Egyptian god Tot, for the attributes assigned to Tot by the Egyptians seem to be similar to those assigned to Hermes by the Greeks, and to Mercury by the Romans. His symbol in Egypt was the ibis, a bird which was found in large numbers on the Nile in ancient times. The ibis was a fitting bird to represent Hermes, since it has a long pointed beak, appropriate for the god who invented writing and letters. According to Plato, when Thuth, Tot, offered the gift of reading and writing to King Thamus, Ammon, the king was displeased because he said it would weaken the memory of his subjects. Tot and Hermes were also associated with number and counting, and they carried messages and prayers to the gods, and guidance from the gods to men. The Egyptian god Tot, though not the Greek Hermes, was also considered to have been the voice of Ra, the Supreme, and to have spoken the creation into existence. A man who had fully realized the qualities of Tot in himself was thus well qualified to discourse on the nature of God, the cosmos, and man. Hermes Trismegistus. The first mention of Hermes with the triple appellation of great, greatest and great is in a record of a meeting of the council of the Ibis cult in Hermopolis in 172 BC. Cicero, Ovid, and Apuleius knew of him. The later was formally credited with the translation of the Greek text of Asclepius into Latin. Writing to Porphyry in the 3rd century AD, the Neoplatonists Iamblichus showed great respect to Hermes. Under the assumed Egyptian name of Abaman, Iamblichus writes, "It is to him that our ancestors in particular dedicated the fruits of their wisdom, attributing all their own writing to Hermes. And if we, for our part, receive from this god our due share of favor, you, for your part, do well in laying before the priests questions about theology." Emma Clark explains, "The exact identity of Hermes named here is deliberately ambiguous. Abaman exploits the supposed attribute of both the Greek Hermes and the semi-divine Hermes Trismegistus, a late antique amalgam of Tot and Hermes." Hermetics and Gnostics. Christianity in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD was permeated by the views of the Gnostic sects, for these sects found it easy to convert to Christianity. The Gnostics, like the Hermetic cult, arose in Egypt, although there was a rather different form of Gnosticism which spread from Persia and Syria. There are some striking similarities between Gnostic and Hermetic beliefs. The Gnostics derived their name from their view of knowledge. This was not something that has to be learnt from a book or heard from another person, but it was received through gnosis, an inward experience of revelation, a sudden illumination. The effect was not dissimilar from that described by Hermes on page 13. Again, this is what Vipassana meditation is all about, gaining wisdom through direct knowledge, not through what someone else is telling you or from a book, but from my direct knowledge of studying the body, the sensations on the body going within, man knowing thyself within instead of without. It's fascinating how it all lines up. Continuing. It is also significant that the examples of second birth given in the Corpus Hermeticum accord in spirit with gnosis. One example is the description in Corpus 13. "O Father, I have been made steadfast through God. I see not with the eyes, but with the operation of spiritual energy in the powers. I am in heaven, in earth, in water, in air. I am in all living creatures and in plants. I am in the womb, before the womb, after the womb. I am present everywhere." The Gnostic texts, which express a very similar enlightenment, For instance, the anonymous author of The Thunder Perfect Mind writes, "I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin." Apart from the similarity between the concept of gnosis and that of second birth, as used in the corpus, there is a similarity in the way concepts, even Platonic ones, are expressed, and a similarity in the use of idiom and figure. For instance, the word pleroma has a special significance both in the Gnostic writings and in the Hermetic. The classical meanings of the word center around completeness and fullness. St. Paul extends the definition of the word to describe the full and perfect nature. But to the Gnostics, it conveyed the sense of the abode of the Almighty. The word is used in this sense in Corpus Hermeticum 16:3, where Hermes describes the pleroma as being the one and in the one. Ion is another word which carried a meaning peculiar to Hermetists and Gnostics alike. In classical Greek, it meant a long time, everlasting time, eternity. In Hermetic and Gnostic writing, it also meant absolute, the supreme deity. The word drunkenness acquired the non-classical meaning of being so immersed in worldly affairs that the words of truth cannot be heard. Jesus says in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, "I found them all drunk. I found none of them athirst." Hermes inquires, "Whither are you being carried, O men, drunk as you are, having swallowed neat the word of ignorance?" If there was a mingling of the true traditions, it seems more likely that the Hermetic writings influenced the Gnostic than vice versa, since there seems to be hardly any awareness of Christianity in the Hermetic writing. This is true even in the prophecy of Egypt's destruction, which might have allowed an opportunity for it without disturbing the ancient Egyptian setting. On the other hand, the Gnostic Christians do seem to have used Hermetic texts for devotional purposes. This is emphasized by their inclusion in the Nag Hammadi library. The great majority of these texts are written in Coptic from a Judeo-Christian standpoint. The inclusion of 4 Hermetic works in a collection of Gnostic devotional literature is an indication that Hermetic literature was considered an integral part of Gnostic study or devotion. This view is reinforced by the fact that one of these pieces is a note from the scribe to the recipient saying that he has many more Hermetic texts, but has not included them because he believed that his recipient already had them. The circulation of Hermetic texts amongst the early Christians may well have been much greater than has been generally recognized. In considering the question of Hermetic influence in Gnosticism, attention should be given to the dating of texts. The approximate dates usually accepted for the composition of the Philosophic Hermetica are 100 to 300 AD. It is also thought that the Greek original of the Asclepius was written towards the end of that period, although the grounds for this are by no means firm. Copenhagen indicates evidence from the texts that Hermetic collections of some kind circulated as early as the 2nd or 3rd centuries. J.P. Mahe points out that the material on which individual treatises are based may come from the 1st century AD or even earlier. Clement of Alexandria, writing in the first half of the 3rd century, claims knowledge of 42 Hermetic books. Bearing in mind the extreme difficulty of establishing dates for these books, chronology alone does not rule out Hermetic influence on the Gnostics during the first 2 centuries of the Christian era. The nature of the Hermetic texts is also significant. One of these is the Discourses on the 8th and 9th spheres, which contains a passage describing gnosis or second birth. This gnosis, as is usual in the Hermetica, is accompanied by a hymn of praise. The Discourse is followed by another piece which consists of a hymn of praise, probably connected to the Discourse. It contains these words: "We rejoice because while we were in the body, you made us divine through your knowledge." In other words, these two texts contain the essence of both Gnosticism and Hermeticism: union with the Supreme while still in the body, an event which was characteristically accompanied by praise. Although the Gnostic sects held widely different views from each other, there was nevertheless a core of beliefs which was common to most, and much of this core, shorn of its Christian clothing, is found in the Hermetica. The essential gnosis was the oneness of the Supreme. This signified more than what is generally meant by monotheism in the Judaic or Christian traditions. God, in his aspect of Father, did not make the cosmos. He is the cosmos, and there is nothing else. This statement of absolute unity is made at the opening of the Asclepius, and also in Gnostic literature. Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, the best known of the Nag Hammadi texts, "When you make the two one, and you make the inner as the outer, and the outer as the inner, so that you will make the male and the female into a single one, then shall you enter the kingdom." Here Jesus is not just proclaiming a fact, he is pointing to a profound spiritual realization to be attained through gnosis. And then of the apparent plurality. As you approach it, it is seen not to exist. Where you see birth, there you see delusion, says Hermes. The Nag Hammadi treatise on the resurrection says of the resurrection, "It is no illusion, but it is truth." Indeed, it is more fitting to say that the world is an illusion. Hermeticists, like the Gnostics, consider only spirit to be real. Again, this coincides with the teachings of S.N. Goenka with the Vipassana, that the world is an apparent reality. The only reality is of spirit. So continuing on. The references to make the male and the female one in the Gospel of Thomas are particularly significant because there is distinctive emphasis in the Gnostic tradition on the importance of women. The sense that each sex contains the powers of the other goes back to ancient Egypt. Hermes has an allegorical passage on how men and women exchange qualities in the sexual act, and it is particularly pointed out in the corpus that man in truth is beyond gender. The human being who has understood that both genders are within has realized the common archetype to them both. I am the Father, I am the Mother, I am the Son, exclaims a divine being in the Apocryphon of John. Such beings contain the creation within them. They are the all. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "But the kingdom is in your center, and it is about you." Hermes has come to the same realization when he declares, "But you are whatsoever I am. You are whatever I do. You are whatever I speak. You are all things, and there is nothing else." How then does apparent evil enter the world, and what is its cause? The root cause is ignorance. It is the ignorance leading to desire for possessions that has to be removed. As has already been mentioned, God has equipped men with consciousness, knowledge, and intelligence for this purpose. Again, this is a direct correlation with the teachings of S.N. Goenka in the Vipassana. Yes, if you haven't guessed, I'm very fond of S.N. Goenka and the Vipassana meditation technique. I think it is the key to enlightenment and true understanding and man know yourself. So it's interesting how it all correlates, the teachings of the Hermetic teachings with that of the teachings of a Gautama Buddha through the Vipassana meditation and the learning of that technique. So continuing on. In the corpus, Hermes gives an allegorical account of man wishing to create and receiving the ascent, though not the command of the Supreme. He does create, but seeing his reflection in nature, mistakes it for himself, and uniting with nature in love, falls into all manner of suffering. In Poimandrius, the title of the first book in the corpus, the nous of the Supreme rescues the soul from such ignorance. Again, a direct reference to the Buddhic teachings where ignorance is the cause of all suffering, and that it's not intellectual ignorance, but it's ignorance of the self, ignorance of who you are. It comes again back to getting rid of the ignorance, your ignorance, and getting rid of your suffering. Man must know yourself. You must understand yourself at the inner level, at the real level, within and not without. Continuing. The accounts of the origin of evil by the Gnostic leaders, Basilides and Valentinus, are quite similar in imagery. The man becomes possessed by evil entities, but it is he himself who has led his desire towards evil. Like Hermes, Valentinus supposes that the lower soul, without the will of her father, and without having released her divine nature, plunged into forbidden territory in order to know her father. She is rescued by the Saviour, who healed her passions and separated them from her by bestowing gnosis. The inner meaning of these myths is the same. Gnosis of the nature of one's real self is the only antidote to evil. It must have been plain to Gnostics and Hermeticists alike that most human beings do not fulfill their potential in this life. It must also have been clear that while some humans appear to make little spiritual progress during their life upon earth, others make much progress very quickly. To the Gnostics and Hermeticists, the presumption was that such souls had been previously embodied, and during that embodiment, spiritual development had taken place. The fact that some babies were born deformed led some to think they were suffering the consequences of injustices that they had committed in a previous lifetime, the voicing of which opinion once cost an England football manager his job. From the beginning of the 2nd century AD, Gnosticism came under the attack of the Orthodox Church. Perhaps this was partly because the Orthodox party felt that, under the threat of persecution, a tighter organization and definition of fundamental Christian beliefs needed to be made. The Church also felt the need for a single literal text that everyone, even the uneducated, could understand. Yes, I think the main reason that the Church took this angle was they didn't want people to do their own research and come to their own conclusions. They wanted to be the ones in control to let people know how to interpret this so that they could retain their power. And I see this also reflected in society today, as the Church and the leaders of the world, our political leaders, even the media, tell us that they'll do the research and to believe what they're doing because they know best, and not to do our own research and not to look into things ourselves. But this just keeps us in ignorance. It prevents us from knowing the reality. It prevents us from getting to know the truth. And it's interesting how the Hermetic teachings can thus be used for a positive or a negative aspect, depending on how it's used. As all things, the good can be manipulated into the negative. So let me start that paragraph again. From the beginning of the 2nd century AD, Gnosticism came under the attack of the Orthodox Church. Perhaps this was partly because the Orthodox party felt that, under the threat of persecution, a tighter organization and definition of fundamental Christian beliefs needed to be made. The Church also felt the need for a single literal text that everyone, even the uneducated, could understand. The fear was that several levels of meaning in the Scriptures would lead to confusion and to individuals interpreting them in their own ways. But the Gnostics, like the Hermeticists, much favored allegory, and they began to feel themselves excluded from the orthodox body of the Church. Allegorical interpretation of the Scriptures did not die, even in the Orthodox Church. St. Augustine, in particular, commends it. With approval, he quotes St. Ambrose as saying, "The letter killeth, but the spirit quickeneth." He goes on to explain how if certain passages were taken literally, they might lead a man to perverse belief. But when spiritually opened by Ambrose, the mystical veil for him had been removed from such texts. Probably later, he insists, unlike some Gnostic writers, that everything written in the Scriptures must be literally true. But he writes of certain passages, "I view them with greater delight under that figurative aspect than if no such figure were drawn from the sacred books, though the fact would remain the same and the knowledge the same." The allegorical interpretation of the Scriptures also persisted in the Desert Fathers, and eventually in the monastic tradition, which later sprang from that early one. This method of interpreting the Scriptures eventually gave birth to the fourfold sense, fully adopted in the Middle Ages, and formulated in particular by St. Thomas Aquinas. Hermes, in the Asclepius, seems to foreshadow different levels of comprehending truth when he writes of intelligence and consciousness. Now, the intelligence of human consciousness consists totally in the memory of past events, but the intelligence of nature can be attained through the capacity of cosmic consciousness from everything which is subject to the senses in the world. The consciousness of eternity, which comes next, has also been bestowed and its quality made known by the sensory world. But the intelligence and quality of the consciousness belonging to the Supreme God, is truth alone. The four senses of which St. Thomas Aquinas speaks are literal or historic, allegorical, tropological, moral, and anagogical. He says of the last, "Insofar as things signify what is involved in eternal glory, we have the anagogical sense." This seems to come close to Hermes' description of the consciousness belonging to the Supreme God, truth alone. There is also connection between the literal and historic level and Hermes' view that the intelligence of human consciousness is totally in the memory of past events. Nevertheless, despite the continuance of this tradition in the Orthodox Church, at least from the early years of the 2nd century, the Church claimed to be the sole mediator of the meaning of Scripture and even of Christ. This claim eliminated all direct mystical experience of truth. Thus, there was a conflict between membership of the Church and direct knowledge or gnosis. The Orthodox party based its position on 4 bulwarks: acceptance of the authority of only those books which became canonical, acceptance of the authority of the Old Testament, total obedience to the bishop, belief in a literal interpretation of the New Testament. By the end of the 2nd century, Gnostics had been virtually expelled from the Church. In the tradition of the early Church, deep religious experience arises from within and constitutes the real spiritual life. Obedience to laws, bishops, and councils, and verbal declarations of belief might or might not assist that life, but they could never be a substitute for it. Gnosis was a true knowledge. The rest was just information, right or wrong. A light went out of the church with the departure of the Gnostics, and with the takeover by Constantine and his successors, the darkness deepened. But the fire of the Spirit can never be extinguished, and the center of spiritual practice, the essence of Gnosticism, retreated to the monasteries and hermitages of Egypt and later of Europe. The influence of Hermes lived on. Two church fathers had a good deal to say about him, but held very different views. St. Augustine tells us that Hermes lived in the time of Moses and was responsible for writing the Asclepius. However, Augustine condemned him as an idolater. Lactantius saw him as an inspired seer who, long before the Christian era, had correctly written about the one God, the Word, and the creation. These two opposing views were taken up by later writers in the Middle Ages. It was that of Lactantius which prevailed. Hermes in the Middle East and Spain. I think I'll end it there, and we'll take up with this next time. Thank you for listening to the end. Please feel free to like.